Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of All Things Policy. I'll be your host today. My name is Kripa, and I'm a program manager here at the Takshashila Policy School. Today, I'm really fortunate to be joined by two in-house guests, two of my colleagues, Suman from the Policy School, as well as Bharath, who works with us here in the Policy School, but also moonlights a little bit in the high-tech geopolitics team. So welcome to both of you.
Thanks, Kripa. Thanks for having us on the show.
Super to have you here. And I have decided to forego a formal introduction simply because I know our listeners are familiar with both of your work. So today I have roped both of these lovely folk in to discuss with me a little bit of some of the implications of AI-related training and work. As we know, for anyone who's followed along with developments in AI, AI really can be as good as the data that it's trained on. We know that AI relies actually on large numbers of data workers in particular who have a range of tasks such as labeling, annotating, validating, moderating data, and all of this is used ultimately to train machine learning models, right? So today actually I'm hoping to discuss the work of data annotation in particular. So before we launch into things and I open up the floor for some conversation, those who may not know, data annotation actually is the process of labeling data to make it easier for machine learning algorithms to actually both process and understand it. Market researchers actually anticipate that the value of the data annotation service market is going to increase from, it used to be 1.89 billion in 2024 and anticipated to grow to up to 10 billion in 2032. And so proper annotation, of course, is important in machine learning because using this high quality data to train your models will improve, as we know, performance, efficiency, allows for AI model customization. So what really is a challenge here? Sounds like actually a really well set up system. But we know that a lot of AI companies that are based actually in high-end countries typically rely heavily on business processing outsourcing firms in low and middle income countries, usually due to the fact that there are weaker labor laws, there are lower labor costs. In India in particular, we know that a lot of the data annotation workforce comes from usually rural or marginalized communities, and typically it's women who take up these jobs, and for a lot of different reasons, right? The role itself of data annotation is promoted as being really flexible. There are a lot of work from home opportunities. However, research over time has actually shown that there are some detrimental impacts on workers. So our conversation today is to unpack some of this. We know that extensive time spent by this workforce staring at content that can sometimes be traumatizing and disturbing has long-term psychological impacts, right? So how do we sort of navigate some of this in a world that's largely talking a lot about AI innovation, and the ethics around AI is now a conversation that's sort of building some traction. But yeah, I'll just open the floor maybe for both of you to sort of share your thoughts. Why do you think this type of labor is largely invisible when we're talking about AI innovation or AI ethics? I guess maybe first, do you feel that this is a largely invisible factor when we're having these conversations? And if so, why do you think that's the case?
Thanks, Kripa, for setting the context really well. So when we think about AI and data being used for AI, so you see that, I think maybe zooming out a little bit. So before addressing this question about data annotation and the psychological impact that it has. So if you zoom out a little bit, you hear about this thing about how AI impacts labor, about how it might be displacing labor, augmenting it, automating some parts of the labor economy and all of that. But this particular aspect of data annotation is kind of like people working for AI. So its annotation is labor for AI in some sense. Right? So you're working to make AI better. And some people frame it as training AI to take away your job in some sense at some point of time. Right? So that it's seen as something that is really dangerous for the workforce because you're training someone to replace you in a sense. But I want to maybe argue that while that sounds like the case, essentially it's just a form of labor arbitrage. So it is a technology that might displace labor, especially lower skilled or certain kinds of labor which are repetitive and which can be even some creative tasks might be displaced. But this is going to happen given this kind of a disruptive technology which is already out there. And you see that companies which might be in developed countries outsourcing this annotation work to, say, a lower or middle income country, especially a rural, someone who needs that flexibility, someone, maybe a woman in India, in rural India, doing this kind of work. It's just labor arbitrage because it is a need that is there, and there is a large workforce that is willing to do this kind of thing, and that gap is, that need is being met. So, and it's not always psychologically traumatizing work. It's
right. It's not exclusively that. Yeah.
So to a large extent, it might be just annotating work. Like maybe they're training it to do better in Indian languages by talking about certain, using different dialects, different Indian languages to train it to do better in Indian languages. So you might think of this as, again, extractive in some sense, but in another way, you can also see that a lot of people might benefit from having an Indian language model doing reasoning or logical tasks, which improves their productivity. Right? So there are both sides to this. And it's also not just cognitive work. So you might think of, even there are workers in factories doing repetitive tasks and whose work is being videographed and used to train robots to maybe do that kind of work at some point, right? So all of these are different kinds of labor for AI. And a part of that is the kind of work that you're talking about, which has maybe detecting harmful content and labeling them, and that can have a psychological impact, which is where the concern is. And why this kind of labor that goes into data annotation is not very visible when we talk about AI is, it's just seen as a part of the effort in creating this kind of a data set. So you see data as being a critical input to building AI, and this is one part of that input that goes into creating that kind of a data set. And there might also be different layers of abstraction or distancing in which a frontier lab might outsource it to a vendor, who then outsources it to a BPO, who then contracts it to, say, a gig worker or a contractor who's doing the real work, right? So, and that might be also to distance them from these kind of impacts that extractive kind of labor that's being done, or the kind of psychological impact that is having. So maybe one part of it is also to build some distance between the company that's benefiting from it and this thing, but also just the way the economy works, and someone is fulfilling this kind of a need by contracting it out, right? So.
Yeah, no, I hear that there is such a diversity of tasks that are needed actually for the system to function, that it's possible that some of these subtasks are sort of, ignored or forgotten. And I also hear your point that when we're speaking of this type of annotation work, it extends beyond being exposed to, traumatic content. And in some ways, I can also see this as being, just to sort of be devil's advocate here, that it actually ends up possibly being a short-term cost that is functionally goes down over time. And as of course the model gets better and trained, you might not require actually as much intensive sort of input. At the same time, I think even if it is a short-term cost, even if the population size or the workforce size that's engaged in this type of labor, which by some estimates is about like 100,000 folks, let's say, even if there's an argument to be made that it's a small enough group, over time anyway the job description is going to change, they're not perpetually going to be subjected to that type of content, let's say, it still, I think, begs the question of, like, while this cost still exists and while there is a population that is impacted by it, does it not warrant some element of sort of attention? But yeah, over to you, Suman, if you had any thoughts on that.
No, I think the concept of invisible labor has always been there. If you, ever since the digital economy actually took off, if you look at,
or even well before, actually,
even before, like call centers, right? You would hear them or you would talk in that sense, but did we talk enough at that time about safety or whatever? Because even the call center environment was shown to sometimes have a negative impact on people's psyche, because they were becoming different individuals altogether, right?
An alter ego almost developing.
Yeah, like you would have a Western name, you would have accent neutralization courses, and you would be two different people in depending on the geography that you were working on. So, right? So this the concept of invisible labor has always been there. But what makes it different now, I think, that firstly it has moved away from, like he was saying, contract. I mean, the big company moves that thing to BPO further subcontracts. So who is accountable for these people? Who's accountable for actions of these people? Who's accountable for what happens to them? It becomes a way of washing your hands off in some manner, saying that the big company always will say that, oh, we just subcontracted it to these people and therefore it's not important. Having said that, yes, it provides economic benefits to these people. In an economy that is starved of jobs, where there are no means of livelihood, I think people are willing to do these things. And like, we should not look at it as only harmful, or there are all kinds of content or all kinds of training that is being done, right? So the difference between what is the extent of the problem and who bears the cost, who bears the benefits, that is a question that we need to ask as policy analysts. And who bears the costs versus who reaps the benefits? If there is a symmetry and there asymmetry, there is always an asymmetry there. Then we need to see what kind of intervention. Should the government intervene? Should the government not? Should companies themselves do something? Should we mandate companies to do something? Those are questions that we need to answer in a larger thing, because this is here to stay. You can't wish this away, right? AI, you can't wish it away. You can't say that, okay, we won't do any of this.
We can't undo some of this, No, and I'm glad you brought some of this up, Suman, because I wanted you're foreshadowing some of the questions I think I had of, so what? Now, if this exists, now what sort of is the next step here? But I hear what you're saying, that there is a precedent that's been set for invisible labor actually fueling a lot of productive effort in the economy. I'm also hearing what you're saying about the fact that, it is what it is. But how do we sort of move forward and now grapple with the impacts of the ripple effect that AI is creating? I think the one thing I think of when I'm thinking of whether this work is invisible is it's becoming slightly more visible, simply because I think the average citizen or consumer is trying to be more aware and better informed about the life cycle of some of these processes, trying to better understand. There's an effort to be more transparent about whether you're thinking about supply chains or generally the processes. There's a sense of accountability that I think sometimes folks are now generationally expecting, simply because information is so readily available. And it's also a way for companies to do a little bit of virtue signaling, to be transparent about some of their process, about how they are being in fact ethical. So I think that's why, even though it's a seemingly small population, and within that small population there are again only maybe a even smaller proportion looking at traumatic content, there still is attention on it, simply because the nature of folks who are engaging with AI right now are grappling with these bigger questions. Who is involved in this process of bringing something that is so customized to me, right? So I think just a segue into the next question I had was, AI and ethics is something that comes up a lot. We have a lot of commentary on this. Folks in this conversation have some commentary, of course, that they've put out on AI and ethics. But do we see actually there's scope for AI to scale and for this development to be scaled really without relying on some of this somewhat exploitative human labor component? And then related to that, in some instance, in the smaller tranche, we're talking of like psychologically harmful work. Is it just here to stay, and is it going to just be a part of the process at some level? Yeah, over to either one of you.
I guess, like we were thinking about it, so this is a job that has to be done so that it makes the platform safer for a lot of people using it. So it's a cost that might not always be factored into the nature of the job or the remuneration that someone's getting, right? So it's a externality in a sense that someone's taking up this job without having an idea about what kind of an impact it takes on their mental health or this thing.
And therefore the impact it has on people around them, society, and all of that.
Yeah.
So it's maybe a tech company gaining the value of this work and making their product better, safer for the people who are using it. But a lot of the impact that it has, intentionally or unintentionally, is not being addressed, and there's an externality. So individuals who are working on it, their families might have to deal with some of these things, or the broader health ecosystem in the country wherever they are, right? So they might be left to deal with some of these consequences. And I think that is the broader issue here. So it is, in a sense, although a lot of coverage on this topic might not speak about it in the same way, but this is a job that someone will have to do at some point so that it can make the platform better. But when someone's doing this job, do they have access to, say, a safer work environment? And are these externalities being accounted for when something like this is done? And when you have multiple levels of contracting and subcontracting this kind of work, how do you assign responsibility along that
continuum of work?
That chain is that's something that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, and I think safety at workplace is something we have actually handled. I mean, we have spoken about in different ways, right? Physical safety, everybody understands, everybody gets. So, construction sites, hard hats are mandatory. Safety equipment is mandatory. On shop floors, again, you have to have processes that are safe.
True.
And if you're dealing with hazardous substances, there is certain, there are all these rules that you have in place. But we somehow cannot seem to grapple that mental health or those kind of
psychological
damage, something that we need to, actually account for in some ways.
No, I'm glad you brought it up, because I think there is part of the growing research in this area proposes these types of interventions. What would it look like to reclassify some of these workers as actually high-risk workers? And so they are extended the same type of protections like that currently exist under the Health and Working Conditions Code to say, actually, why don't we include, a formal risk assessment process? Why don't we have an employee insurance, mandatory psychological health monitoring? Like all these things are already folded into the considerations when we consider high-risk work. And usually that's the struggle sometimes when thinking of possible interventions to support this workforce is, how do we classify them? Are these gig workers, and do they get protections under that? And that's been only a recent win for, a lot of different states. And in India, we're seeing where there are, actually legislation is being rolled out to actually care for a gig worker, and just not seeing it as a transactional task of, well, there's an employment shortage. This is a viable job that requires low skill labor. Marriage made in heaven. Nothing more needs to be done by the state or by the market. I think it's a really interesting sort of point to, I think, bring up. I think so that maybe just segues into maybe a last sort of question I had for both of you of, what does it look like for responsibility in a way to be taken up for the impact of this type of work? So if we accept that, AI is here to stay, some of the impacts of that for the ecosystem to exist is one that requires human labor in this particular way. Who should take responsibility for some of these impacts, right? Like we know already out there are publicly, you have some of these, there are tech companies or AI companies that specifically talk about protections they have in place for content moderators. They give guidance on how you need to engage with the content, or they might even, give employee assistance programs will exist. And even so, there are a lot of claims that, there are investigations, lawsuits coming up about how these protections are inconsistent, especially when it's outsourced, when there are so many levels of separation between obviously the company and HQ sitting somewhere in the US and someone in Jharkhand who's working on this, then it's very hard to say, yes, we can confidently say employee assistance programs are running well. So what does it look like, does it look like more, government intervention here? Does it look like government holding companies more accountable for, safeguards for such workers? I don't know. What are your general thoughts?
I think the responsibility should lie with the companies who are benefiting from it. So the tech companies who benefit from this work as an input, so they should be the ones responsible for it. But again, because of the way it is contracted out, so it's hard to assign responsibility along that value chain. So maybe what you need is transparency about how this work eventually gets outsourced and where is it being done and how is it fed back as an input. So you need visibility into those practices.
And also at a high level, what percentage of this work is harmful?
Yes.
Yeah. How much of it is each person actually doing, and therefore what is? Again, you can't say how much will. I mean, just because somebody is working very little on harmful content,
it's a tough one to quantify when there's so much qualitative research out there of how traumatizing it is actually.
For some people, it might be very traumatizing. Just watching one video or whatever.
Sure.
For others, it may not be. So how do you
grapple with that?
But even so, we need high-level data on what is the extent of this kind of work that is being done. And the more we talk about it, I think, all of these other, safeguards that have been won labor safety have been only because people have been talking. There have been movements around
and there's so much scrutiny on the process that people are demanding for.
And very often, I think, in our quest for economic growth, we tend to tell people it's okay, ignore it, as long as people are getting thing. This happened at Foxconn.
As long as we are lifting people up out of poverty, that should be good enough.
That should be good. It happened. It happens in every conversation about large scale manufacturing, large scale anything. But should we be talking about it? Definitely, we should be talking about it. But I mean, to tell people don't talk about it because it brings people up out of poverty, I think is very disingenuous, and that is not the way to look at it.
No, I think I think you're right. Like there are so many actors that are implicated at different points in this to actually make sure that there are. I mean, exactly like you said, because there's a lot of public outcry that happened on how gig workers were treated. Now suddenly we have a code on social security where aggregators are contributing 1 to 2% of annual turnover for a social security fund, which is would not have been thought of, I think, previously, right? Or would not have proactively been offered up by some of these companies themselves in some way. Yeah, Bharath, any thoughts on that?
I think, like Suman was saying, we need some kind of a risk classification of the kind of annotation work that happens, and you need more transparency into how this work gets done and who is it being outsourced to and how that actually gets done, right? So, but maybe to sum it up, I guess it is something that's required in some sense to make it a safer online place for a lot of people to. So, but how do you do it responsibly is I guess the bigger question. And even with the broader question on labor for AI, it is a form of labor arbitrage. There are a lot of people who are willing to do this. So thinking about it in the sense that it should not be allowed, or there's not
right. Elimination is, I think, not at all a question. You're right.
So thinking of it as something that you should not allow this because this AI is going to take away your job, or these people who are doing it will be replaced. I don't know if that's the right way to look at it, because if you don't do it here, someone else will. I mean, it'll get done in one way
elsewhere.
or another. And I guess it is a requirement that is there at least for the short term. And so that's.
No, I think you're right. Like introducing some of that nuance, but also saying that even if it contributes to a possibly statistically not a significant sort of proportion of the workforce, that there are actually small things that could be sort of introduced. But again, as long as there is some eyeballs on this, and also recognizing the limitations of what can reasonably be done. Like you said, it's not reasonable maybe to consider this as a complete elimination of the task. And similarly, if it's eliminated in the Indian market, doesn't mean that it's not taken up at a different low and middle income country that has a need. A lot of the case studies come out of a lot of African countries where simply because a job is on offer, it's appealing. And in some ways it's seen as, I'm just thinking of like a woman in India who takes up this work. It's seen as, how flexible is this as an opportunity? I should just be grateful I have a job that doesn't have, it's not physically onerous, maybe in the same way that you might see your male counterparts working out there. But yeah, I think having the conversation and sort of continuing that seems to be definitely a big part of how to possibly create some sort of change going forward. Yeah. Well, when we conclude here, I do want to thank both my guests. Thank you, Bharath. Thank you, Suman. A real pleasure to have you both. And for those who are interested, you may have also seen an article in The Guardian that came out last month that talks about India's female workers in particular who are contributing to the training of AI process. So I'll encourage you to read that amongst many other excellent resources that are out there on the issue. And with that, we'll conclude. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.